Hello everyone, Karnasa here, and welcome back to For All Kerbalkind. As a preface to this episode, I just want to address a few comments I've been receiving about the series, and well, the main one being why I didn't release an episode last time along with Beardy and N9. Currently I'm doing closer to year-long episodes. As I'm still early game, it takes me quite a while to get anything done. Beardy and N9 are releasing their episodes roughly every 6 months in game, so that means for every episode of mine you get, there'll be 2 from the Soviets and the US. This will change as my build queues are expanded upon, and I can reliably churn out more rockets than I know what to do with. Whenever that happens, I'll be joining the 2-week schedule with the others. Until then, if you want more in between, I do post updates on the series over on my Patreon, including full upcoming clips from the episodes, such as the Vulcan launch later on in this one. All the craft files and custom configs I write are also available to download from there, and of course, any tier gets their name at the end, and who doesn't want their name immortalized by a 10-second clip at the end of a video maybe 3 people and their pet chicken will watch. Short plug aside, onto current events. At the end of the last episode, the Commonwealth Space Commission put their first satellite, Caliban I, into orbit, so that of course means I'm going back to sounding rockets. On the 1st of November 1964, the Commonwealth Space Commission launches Skylark III, a simple-sounding rocket with one goal: breach the Kármán line and attempt to recover a live payload positioned on top of the rocket safely back on the surface of Earth. This, if successful, will likely be the last sounding rocket, as with the Commission's current tech and infrastructure, there are much more lucrative missions to be flown in orbit. The Skylark with rebalanced avionics performs flawlessly and achieves an altitude of 267 kilometers, smashing the height required for the contract, and also providing a much-needed boost of science from the experiment itself. Completing the suborbital hot recovery contract was the main reason for flying this though. I had already picked up the mission, and I'm currently in no state to be failing anything. I successfully deploy the parachute attached to the biological sample, and after a short time, the fruit flies land safely in the Australian outback. I gained enough science from that mission to get myself another upgrade point, which I whacked straight into research and development before going into mission control and picking up the Lunar Impactor Uncrewed contract. This gave me quite a sizable advance of funds, which I then went and spent on a lot more build points in the VAB and R&D. I actually have to focus on R&D this time rather than pouring it all into the VAB because I actually have stuff to research now. Speaking of, I am going to come into research and development and pick up early human spaceflight era science. The only reason I went for this is because it's quite cheap and it will gain me more science. You know the old saying, spending science gets you science. Anyway, I am going to skip now ahead to the 13th of January 1965, which is when my mission control was upgraded. This upgrade allowed me to pick up another couple of contracts, and I decided to go for Pass the Kármán line crewed, because I do have an invention up my sleeve which we will be launching later on, and I also picked up the Lunar flyby uncrewed, which hopefully with the Impactor contract that I picked up earlier, I should be able to get those both done with a single vehicle. The advances from those contracts allowed me to get a nice 50-30 split between the VAB and R&D in Kerbal construction time. And now with my money completely spent, it's just a little bit of a time warp until Caliban II, the Commonwealth Space Commission's first polar orbiter, is ready to be launched. On the 31st of January 1965, just over 3 months after the first Caliban satellite was successfully launched to low Earth orbit, the Black Duke launch vehicle once again fires up its single RZ-2 engine. This time, instead of going due east from Woomera Space Center, the rocket will attempt to place this identical satellite into a polar orbit. In order to achieve this, I attempt to fly due south, using MechJeb's surface features on Smart ASS. Unfortunately, I don't know how this works half of the time, so I started off this launch actually going north. Now, because I am in quite a southern latitude, I would much rather be going south, and that way as well I won't be ditching any of my spent stages in the outback. They will land safely in the southern Indian Ocean. I had to look that up, I wasn't actually sure which ocean was directly south of Australia, but it turns out it's still called the Indian Ocean. This satellite, if successful, should hopefully be able to complete 2 contracts that I have picked up. First polar orbit satellite and first solar powered satellite. To achieve that second contract, I am going to have to place this in a much higher orbit than Caliban I. The minimum perigee for that contract is 300 kilometers, which is quite high. The Black Duke first stage has now been fully depleted of fuel though, and I fire up the Gamma 8 on the Black Arrow 1 stage of this launch vehicle. Shortly after Black Arrow 1 has fired, the payload fairings are deployed to reveal the exact same satellite that I launched in the last episode. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And this satellite is more than capable of completely filling all of the contract requirements and has every single piece of science that I own at the moment on board. This is going to be particularly useful with the early TV camera experiment because I'm going to be flying over every single biome of Earth, and that experiment is biome specific. Also, with the solar panels on the Caliban series of satellites, this thing will run out of electric charge in a very long time. I still am using very early tech solar panels, so it won't last indefinitely, but it will last long enough for me to cover the entire Earth and get all of the science that I possibly could from these early experiments. Also, the fact that this has a camera on it means that maybe if I'm a little bit curious as to seeing what the Soviets and the US are getting up to, well, I can just have a look at the live feed. I don't think it's a live feed, but you know, we've got a camera on this thing. I'm no longer stuck in the dark. I don't have to worry about if the Soviets or the US, whatever they're doing. I now have at least some indication, even if it is a very, very basic early TV camera. It's nothing like the advanced spy satellites that the Soviets and the US are currently keeping in low Earth, or well, weather satellites, I should say. There's certainly a lot of weather going on in the Earth at the moment. Anyway, back to the mission at hand. You may have noticed that I left this rocket to coast for a little while. The reason I did this is because I wanted to try and get my perigee, well, my apogee at the moment, to about 300 kilometers, which is where I did need it in order to complete the contract. And in order to try and get as close to that as possible, I did wait for a little while before firing up the final stage. I did have some RCS on there which I could ullage with, so that wasn't a concern. The Gamma 2 fired perfectly. But unfortunately, you may be able to see my periapse height at the moment was slightly under 300 kilometers. I didn't quite make it, but with said RCS motors, I was able to get this to a 301 kilometer perigee, which is more than enough to fulfill both the solar powered contract and also the polar orbit contract. As we can see, I have already completed first polar orbit satellite, but I need to keep this satellite up for 14 days in order to achieve the solar power contract. Yeah, lots of contracts there. And I am able to achieve this. And I do have power by the end of this mission. However, I did run into a slight bug. Where it says have positive energy balance, well, the game didn't think that I had that after the 14 days, even though my electric charge was completely full. As I mentioned, the solar panels on this are more than capable of keeping this fully charged pretty much indefinitely, or for a really long time. I think this may have happened because I have 2 different avionics units on this design. I've got 2 science cores that are shaped together to form the basic structure of the Caliban satellite, and one of them has no electric charge on it at all. It doesn't even have storage for it. So I checked with Beardy and N9 and they said that it was okay for me to just Alt F12 complete that contract. With those 2 completed, I now had another couple of spaces in mission control to get even more funding, so I went in and picked up the first orbital return contract, as well as uncrewed lunar orbit, as these gave me the most money out of all available. I spent some of that money on unlocking balloon tanks and tooling the blue streak I designed at the end of the last episode, and then the rest of it was once again poured into Kerbal construction time. It was at this time though grave news arrived from the Soviet Union. The first publicised attempt at launching a crew on board their super heavy launch vehicle, the N1, ended with disaster. The 2 crew on board the flight, Pavel and German Kerman, were tragically killed. Little is known about what went wrong with the flight. Hopefully this event will never replicate itself. back to Australia now for my own crewed endeavour. Hopefully the sad events from the Soviet Space Agency have not shaken my Kerbals too much, as Jeffrey Kerman begins preparations to become the first British Kerbal in space. On the 17th of April 1965, the Commonwealth Space Commission requests the use of an Avro Vulcan from the Royal Air Force, and their request is granted immediately upon learning what the Vulcan will be used for: to send the first British Kerbal to space, even if only very briefly. At 9:30 AM local time, the Vulcan takes off from the Space Centre's north-facing runway, banks and heads east for 750 kilometers, the distance required for the special payload on board to safely make it back to the runway. As sitting most precariously on top of this rather large plane is a little bit of a smaller one, there is an English electric lightning mounted to the top of the Vulcan. This has been modified so that I can actually use it as an X-plane. I designed this plane quite a long time ago, and I just really wanted to get to use it. I haven't actually unlocked the proper Avon engines for this design yet, so instead what I have done is strapped on two of the Black Knight engines, the Gamma 4, the Gamma 301s where the Avon engine should be, and my plan is to do a little bit of a suborbital hop with the electric lightning, the space lightning if you will. After reaching 750 kilometers downrange, Jeffrey de Kerman fires up the two Gamma 301 engines mounted onto the back of this spaceplane and is released from the Vulcan and begins his journey towards the Kármán line. I had a bit of a play around with some designs using the electric lightning as an X-plane, and actually replacing the jet engines on the back was the best way that I could come up with to actually get this to breach the Kármán line and even space. After burning the Gamma 301s for their rated burn time, I kill the engines and Jeffrey de Kerman does indeed make it to space. His apogee is 142 kilometers, so he only just makes it, but he is definitely the first British Kerbal to get to space. And now comes Reentry, which honestly wasn't that terrible. We had a little bit of an explosion there, but that was nothing too important. It was just a little bit of detailing at the front of the plane, nothing critical. And now we attempt to land back at the Space Center. The reason why I said 750 kilometers earlier is because I know that is roughly where I need to be in order to get this to land safely back at the Space Center. And here we go. We are nicely lined up with the runway. However, I'm going a little bit too slow. Somehow, Jeffrey de Kerman survives that. To be honest, I am quite frankly shocked that Jeffrey de Kerman is still with us, because that looked very bad. I was incredibly lucky that that didn't actually kill him. Unfortunately though, it does mean that my electric lightning is now out of use, and if I do want to fly it again, I'm going to basically have to rebuild the entire thing. The fact that the crew capsule did survive though, is going to make the build time of it a lot quicker than if I were to rebuild the entire thing from scratch, so that might be something that I do in the future. But to be honest, I think I'm going to veer away from the X-planes for now, because I probably should start looking at doing my own orbital crewed flights. That is the kind of situation that I am in. But talking of crewed orbital flights, two very important milestones have been achieved by both the Soviet Union and the United States. Rodina 5 from the Soviet Union and Trinity 2 from the US both touched back down on Earth on the 22nd of May 1965, the same day. These aren't the lunar landings, although with the completion of both of these missions, the two space agencies are now free to go for their lunar landings. They have orbited the moon using the full stacks, and that was the last required mission. A delegate from the Commonwealth Space Commission was invited along to the Trinity 1 launch, the test of the Caliban V launch system in low Earth orbit. When asked their thoughts on the launch of such a pivotal mission, they only replied with two words: awe-inspiring. But while one member of the Commonwealth Space Commission was watching the US's achievements, another, Jeffrey Decouplers, had other plans with the Soviet Union. On the 25th of May 1965, a Soviet Ku-144 touched down at an undisclosed Air Force base in the United Kingdom. This wasn't a hostile redirect, but very much planned, as Jeffrey, enamored with his first taste of space, very much wanted more, and the member nations of the CSE struck a deal with the Soviets to send one of their Kerbals to space, this time to stay. Thanks to the capabilities of the Soviet supersonic passenger plane, Jeffrey makes it to Baikonur Cosmodrome in record time. During its stay at undisclosed Air Force Base UK, however, some engineers on site can't help but remark on its similarities to an in-development project between Aerospatiale based in France and the British Aircraft Corporation. Probably just a coincidence, right? Arriving 3 days before the scheduled launch of Soyuz 4 allows Jeffrey to brush up on his Russian. He'll definitely be needing it sharing a cramped confined space with none other than Valentina Kerman for the next 2 weeks. But on the 29th of May, Jeffrey and Valentina board Soyuz 4, and Soviet mission control begins the final countdown for Jeffrey to become the first British astronaut. Soyuz 4 performs flawlessly. I have to say that I was a little bit concerned placing the lives of my Kerbals in the hands of the Soviets after the aforementioned Rodina 4 disaster. It was a little bit concerning, but that's the N1. This is a Soyuz. I know the Soviets and Beardy has been flying these for a very long time now, or at least some sort of derivative of the Soyuz. I imagine he's got a lot of test data on these engines, and as mentioned, this did perform extremely well. I didn't personally fly this mission to space. I just got some cinematics of the launch at a later date. The plan was Beardy was going to be flying this rocket. He would do the launch, and then once that was done, the save file would be spliced, and I would take control of the Soyuz module once it was in orbit. The 7KOK decouples from the Soyuz rocket. Now it is in space. It is time for Jeffrey to take control. Upon taking control of the spacecraft, Jeffrey Kerman confirms everyone's worst fear. It is actually rather difficult to drink tea in space. With the Soyuz now fully deployed, Jeffrey's first real task is to orient the spacecraft so that the solar panels are pointing towards the sun, so we don't run out of electric charge anytime soon. Now, before performing any drastic maneuvers with this spacecraft, I decide to let it complete a couple of orbits of Earth. Obviously, it's Jeffrey's first extended stay in space, and he still needs to get his space legs. Next up on the list is for Jeffrey to perform a few maneuvers using the onboard engine. This was totally to get some training for future missions, and definitely not due to the fact that the orbit didn't quite hit 500 kilometers, and if it did, I would get a hefty pay bonus from achieving that milestone. No, Jeffrey just needs to learn how to perform some maneuvers in space, but coincidentally, as you may be able to see there, we did also hit that 500 kilometer milestone at the same time. That's pretty nice. 500 kilometers did mean that this craft slipped ever so slightly into the Van Allen belts, and obviously with Kerbalism on this install, that was going to be a big problem. This was dealt with though after completing just one orbit that put me over 500 kilometers by burning retro and bringing the orbit back down to about 400 kilometers, which is where Beardy handed me over the spacecraft. At this altitude, I might ever so slightly dip into the Van Allen belts, but it's not going to be problematic at all. And in fact, by the end of this mission, Jeffrey Kerman's radiation levels were still at 0%. And obviously Valentina's too, because she is also on board this spacecraft, but we don't mind what happens to her. She's Beardy's problem. If she gets fully irradiated on a mission that I flew, then yeah, maybe that is my fault. But no, we were absolutely fine with the radiation on this spacecraft. Next up on the agenda for this mission was to complete a day in space. I wanted to get the day-long crew milestone because that was going to pay me a lot of money. And also, I wanted to ensure that Jeffrey Kerman was situated quite nicely within the Soyuz spacecraft, and he was having an okay time in space before subjecting him to his first ever extravehicular activity. That was the plan for this mission. I was also going to perform an EVA, due to the fact that the Soyuz is perfectly capable of doing that. However, there was a slight problem with that plan, in the fact that I have not upgraded my astronaut complex, so currently I am unable to perform any EVAs. I did hover over the EVA button earlier on in the video, and it was grayed out, which was a little bit of a shame. So instead of performing EVAs that would have gotten me a lot of science, no additional funding, yes, I just kept this in orbit for 14 days. It would have been really nice as well, because the two astronauts on board do actually have different spacesuits to indicate the different countries that they are from. It was a nice little touch that Beardy did add, and unfortunately I will not be able to showcase that due to the fact that I can't perform EVA. So I am terribly sorry about that, but in the future we hopefully should see some more interesting spacesuits and actually see the flags of the countries that the individual Kerbals are on these collaborative missions that hopefully there should be quite a lot more of down the line in this series. Anyway, that is for the future, and what we are doing now is trying to return the Soyuz safely back down to the surface. Beardy gave me one request when doing this: land in the Soviet Union. Don't give Valentina over to the Americans. I don't think he would be very happy with me if I passed N9 over a free Kerbal, so I made sure that my maneuver was plotted out very well, and earlier on I did fire up the onboard engine for the Soyuz and placed us into a trajectory that would take us quite close to Baikonur Cosmodrome while still in the day, after spending 14 days in low Earth orbit. Now all that remained to fly for this mission was to safely bring the Soyuz descent module back down to the surface of Earth, and having never flown this before and having done no simulations, I didn't really know what I was doing, but I was able to get very close to Baikonur using descent mode on the module. I was only about a couple of 100 kilometers away from the launch site. The thermal cover of the Soyuz was discarded and the parachute went off successfully. However, I decoupled the heat shield a little too early, which unfortunately came crashing back into the bottom of the Soyuz capsule. Now, I'm not going to say that this caused any problems. However, when landing, obviously the Soyuz has a retro motor in it, so that it can kill off the last few meters per second before hitting the ground. Oh well, we do successfully touch down, although I do imagine Valentina and Jeffrey are feeling a little dazed after hitting the ground at 6 meters per second. Anyway, with the recovery of Soyuz 4, I gained 1.4 million funds, and I don't really know what I'm going to be doing with that money. Well, I actually do. I upgrade the VAB to level 2, so I can unlock a new build queue. I also upgrade my tracking station, so that in the future, I will be able to communicate with interplanetary probes which is definitely something that I am going to be looking at doing in the next episode. Going into research and development, with the science that I gained, I unlocked some new engine nodes, including the first Hydrolox node and 1962 orbital rocketry. Now, these aren't going to be very useful for me at the moment because they don't have any engines in there that I can use. However, we are going to be shifting the tech tree around a little bit, so that it means that I have a logical progression of rockets to work with, akin to what the Soviets and the US get, because at the moment the European designs are based very much on where they are in real life, and obviously I am starting this save a little bit earlier than ESA or the Black Arrow or anything that I've been doing so far really existed. Finally, you might be thinking, where on earth has all the ESA stuff been? I announced at the end of the last episode that I would be forming ESA. Well, unfortunately I needed to wait for an influx of cash so that I could go and upgrade Kourou, which will be my primary launch site, but with the money that I gained, I went to Kourou and I purchased the 350-ton launch pad. This is going to be required for Ariane launches or Europa 3 launches, whatever they are going to be called, but it still will take me a very long time because I don't have any build points over in French Guiana at the moment. I do place a few in here before leaving though, and it does bring the build time down to 1,300 days. I will be pouring more points into this though, to hopefully get that built up quicker. And now, unfortunately, my episode is going to have to be cut a little bit short due to the fact that the Americans and the Soviets are trying to land on the moon or something. So here is a little bit of a teaser of what is to come. Make sure you go check out what the US and the Soviets have been up to over on Beardy's and N9's channels. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I'd like to give a big thanks to Winterfox and the rest of my members and patrons for their continued support, but please now enjoy the launch of a highly detailed Blue Streak Black Prince rocket, and until the next one, I have been Karnasa, and I will see you later.